Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this online discussion on collections-based learning during COVID, which is very kindly hosted by the Universeum network. I do see some familiar faces here, but also new ones. So for those who don't know about Universeum, this is a European university heritage network that brings together colleagues from all over Europe working across university collections and museums. And it's really great that despite the limits on our mobility at the moment, we can still be connected and build on each other's experiences, reflections, and initiatives. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Anna, and I'm curator at the Museum of Domestic Design and Architecture, which is part of Middlesex University in London, and my role there has been largely about developing pedagogies using objects across a very diverse interdisciplinary curriculum. And before I say anything more about the running order of events and the topics, I'd also like to introduce my colleague and co-organizer of today's event, Annelies van der Ven, who is a researcher working with archaeological collections at UCL Leuven and is joining us from Belgium and is also working magic to keep everything running very smoothly on Microsoft Teams today. So the running order of the day is that I will be giving an overall introduction and some housekeeping details, and then we'll have the contributions from the 6 speakers, then a Q&A that Annelies will moderate. And I should say that we are recording this to make it available online after the event for those who weren't able to make it. So if you don't want to feature, please do get in touch with Annelies or myself, and we will remove the footage before putting anything up online. So to introduce the thinking behind today, Annelies and I met about a year ago at a Universeum conference in the Czech Republic, and since then we've been having quite a lot of conversations about what it means to meaningfully engage students with collections, and this led us to consider a range of themes around university museums and education, especially touching on issues such as decolonizing, social justice and co-creation. And right now we would have been in Belgium holding a workshop on some of these themes. But then, of course, lockdown happened and this conference was cancelled. So we felt that there was an urgency to maybe reflect more closely about the function of university museums at this juncture and what other colleagues are going through and what sort of things they're thinking about. So the conversation today, we hope, will build and expand on this theme of learning with collections, which, needless to say, is a crucial aspect of museums and university museums in general, but especially one that has attracted a lot of interest in the past decade or so, with lots of interesting research going on around haptic kinds of engagement, about how to build critical and analytical skills, about how to bring arts and science together. But for both of us, I think I could say for Annelies and myself, suddenly having to deal with all of these questions around how we learn with collections creatively and think outside the box in the midst of lockdown threw up lots of new question marks. How do we do this online? Can we do it online? Should we do it online? What challenges does it present? What opportunities does it afford? So this was the prompt to begin a conversation with other colleagues, and that is really the purpose of the day. And I'm really pleased to say that we're joined by a fantastic lineup of 6 speakers who all come from different backgrounds across the areas of the arts, anthropology, archaeology, and science. And you can find their bios on the Eventbrite page. And Annelies is also be posting links. So I'm not really going to be giving very lengthy introductions, but they will also be introducing themselves. I should say that all of our speakers are based in the UK, and we hope to have secured more speakers from elsewhere in Europe. However, time wasn't on our side, and colleagues whom we contacted in other countries were, in the end, unable to join us. So where we're at the event today doesn't provide a comprehensive picture, but hopefully it might still speak to the experiences of colleagues in other places. And in the discussion, we would also like to invite you not only to ask questions, but also to maybe share what is it that you are doing in your respective universities and respective countries. And we are keen to hold further events in the future that might recruit more diverse geographical participation. So do get in touch with Annelies and myself after this event if you would like to contribute in such an event. So we do want to allow sufficient time for discussion and have given each speaker just 7 to 10 minutes, and we will be very strict with time. So we will have the speakers staggered one after the other and then open to the group discussion and Q&A. You should be able to see a speech bubble on the bar. You can type questions also during the panel, and we'll come back to these during the Q&A when you'll be able to ask more questions. So bearing in mind everything I've just said, I just wanted to provide a bit of the framework of how we approach speakers, and we asked them to reflect on 4 questions that we thought would be helpful to consider in the context of learning and collections during COVID. So I'm just going to outline these questions. The first one being, what approaches to collections-based learning and student engagement were being used before the COVID-19 pandemic? Then followed by the second question, what challenges are we facing in moving to collections-based learning online? Thirdly, what strategies have been devised to address these challenges, successful or otherwise? So keen to understand both what has worked, but also what hasn't. And finally, what elements of the new working environment will you keep after COVID?
I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Judy Wilcox, who runs the Museum and Study Collection at Central St Martin's, University of the Arts, London. Judy, over to you.
Is really working with objects and teaching with objects and making objects is so key to what all of our staff and students are doing all of the time. So while we do still do quite a lot of object-based learning, which is subject specific, so we do still show textiles to textile students, but really we're focusing on objects as mediators. So we're thinking very much about objects as a focal point for self-reflection, for thinking about the meaning-making process, for thinking about cultural difference. And we've been working really hard to embed object-based learning in curriculum development at the university, not just us, but special collections across all of the colleges. And as a result of our efforts, object-based learning has been written, excuse me, into the 5-year learning, teaching and enhancement strategy for the whole university. So I would say pre-pandemic, we were really feeling like we were in a robust position and we were getting good numbers, real students into a real space to do real stuff. And then the pandemic hit and we walked out of our offices and our museum stores on the week of the 14th of March, and I haven't been able to be back in the building since. So what a huge challenge that has been to our professional practice, because so much of what we do is based on slow looking, deep looking, haptic engagement. And I've spent the last decade of my life in the university trying to get students off the internet and into the classroom to look at real objects. And now we find that we're having to go the other way. But I always, professionally and personally, I'm really trying to see the light and the opportunities that are offered, not least because this is giving us a period of reflection, that endless pressure to increase your visitor figures, to be teaching all the time. So suddenly we have this moment where we can think about how we might use the digital and think about what we do that might be translatable into the digital realm. So we've got a number of platforms that the university is already working with. Hands up, I was doing Zoom tutorials in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, but I think we've all settled down now into a much better, more ethical way of working. And the platforms that we're using in UAL are Moodle and Blackboard Collaborate. So that gives us an opportunity to think about what we're calling synchronous and asynchronous teaching. And really that's trying to respect the fact that this kind of live interaction is very difficult for a lot of people. Our students have access to very varying ranges of technology, and some of them are calling in from countries where it's much more difficult than others, and we have time zone differentiation. I know students who've begged laptops, knackered old laptops off restaurants that they work in to try and get online. So we're trying to do as much of the online teaching as we can through pre-recorded sessions and stuff that isn't particularly data hungry. So Moodle is really great for putting up short films, images, question and answer sessions. Although Moodle does have the capacity for students to kind of break out and have chat conversations amongst themselves. We also have something called Blackboard Collaborate, which is not unlike what we're doing at the minute, which allows you to do live teaching as well. So we're thinking about how the pre-recorded and the live might work well together. It's also been a huge challenge to us because so much of what we do is about spending deep time working with objects. So I would expect students to be working on their own or maybe having conversations around objects which are taking half an hour, 45 minutes. And we know, God, I know from doing these things that the attention span for the digital is much less. And we've been advised by our digital teams that really a 7-minute chunk of information is as much as students can take in before they need some kind of breather, hopefully, preferably for some kind of interaction. So we're trying really hard to use those capabilities of the applications, like the Q&A sessions. So that's, we talk, we present, we take a break. It's an opportunity for students either to chat to one another or to think about what they've learned. And Moodle allows us to kind of moderate some of the stuff that's coming back. We've been really lucky to be able to work with some learning technologists, because this is not my forte. I can design the learning materials, but I really struggle with the under the bonnet of web applications. So we've been really lucky that we've had some accomplished technologists who can explain to us what the capabilities are and help us think about how we translate what we do in the classroom to the digital realm. But it's an iterative process, and as we've worked through thinking about our sort of portfolio of key activities, some of them just don't work. So initially we were thinking, okay, detailed object analysis, what have we got in terms of our digital assets? Are there objects where we have maybe 10, 20 photographs? Could we repurpose those online to let students do a sort of forensic analysis of an object? And the answer is no, you can't. They have to really, to a certain extent you can, but they have to really have the object and feel the weight of it in their hand, and to be able to turn it around and interrogate it in the way that their unfurling thought process demands. But there are other activities which work much better. So visual analysis of flat artworks is great. Thinking about intelligent interrogation of archives translates really well. And we've also been doing some stuff around ludic practice or playfulness, and something like object dominoes, where you're encouraged to make connections between different objects in different ways, also translates really well to the digital realm. So it's just really having a go and seeing and feeling what works well and what doesn't. We're hoping come October to be back in the college and teaching. We can't shift everything online. We are a haptic institution, a making institution. So we are planning with the new metre plus social distancing rule that come October, we'll be in studios and workshops and libraries and in the museum. But even with the new social distancing rules, I would guess safely we're only going to be able to get something like 8 students in our study space at a time. And suddenly we're going to have to think about cross-contamination. So if I have to see 100 students, I can't put out 10 objects and see 10 groups one after another. We're going to have to think about quarantining objects after they've been looked at. There are all sorts of complexities that are involved in keeping the staff and the students as well as the objects safe. So for me, while the digital realm is never going to be a substitute for real stuff and real people, that's why I do the job that I do, because I feel like real stuff, real people equals really amazing interactions. But I feel like we're learning an incredible amount during this pandemic, and that if we can take our learning about doing things in the digital realm forward, that we'll be able to develop a more blended approach, which I think will be particularly helpful for us when we're dealing with larger groups. And the larger groups that we see have been an ongoing challenge for us. Our foundation courses have maybe 100 students. Some of the first year cohorts for things like graphic design are similarly big. And we're contributing now every year to this major interdisciplinary unit for second year design students. And there might be 500 of those in the cohort this year. And I feel like being able to offer them some kind of digital activity before they come to the museum will much better prepare them for what's going to happen when they get to the object handling session. And I feel like I am trying to see the light in this pandemic. Obviously, it's been challenging and horrible and dreadful for so many people. But in a way, I feel like we've been talking about using the digital for years and we've just never had the time or the capacity to do it. And here we've had a term where we haven't been teaching in our space, and we've had access to learning technologists, to technology that we haven't been using before. And we're developing a kind of support toolkit that going forward, I think, will help us to really enhance the physical experience. And we also have to be realistic. So I don't want to veer into UK politics, but we are running at a slightly higher infection rate level than a lot of other countries who've loosened their lockdown. And I think we are anticipating that there's going to be a second spike, even if it's local. And so I feel like we need to be thinking all the time with our teaching over the next year, and who knows for how long, that if this is what we're physically planning with this course this term, or with academic support this term, what do we do if we suddenly find we have to lock the building again? So this kind of digital portfolio, I think, is going to support us not just in dealing with larger cohorts, but in preparing for the potential of a repeat of what we've experienced in the last 3 months. I think that's everything I want to say.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks so much for, I think, starting this conversation in bringing up so many important issues, I think. And I think I really liked also the way that you're talking about this, the digital in terms of moving forward, but how it's in terms of how you might be thinking about larger groups and that blended learning approach, and how this has been a time to actually have a more critical and informed thinking about how we use the digital. So I think that's, I'm sure there'll be lots of other questions and things to be commented on that, but I think we're just going to move on to the next speaker. So I'm going to introduce Kate Arnold Foster, who is Director of the Museum of English, Rural Life and Special Collections at the University of Reading, and they've been developing also quite a lot of thinking there about how to engage students through digital means within their museums program. So I'm going to hand over to you, Kate.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. I don't think I've managed to get to a virtual conference with quite this number of participants, but it's lovely to hear from you all. A lot of what Judy has just said resonates with me, though I work in a slightly different context. And I'll just say a little bit about that. Like her, I can tell you a little bit about where we were before the pandemic and where we've got to and how we're looking ahead. I'm responsible for university museums and special collections, which is the sort of university's archive collections and rare book collections. And we work as a sort of integrated service with very, very diverse collections. So they don't particularly align with one or even two specific academic disciplines. And we've had to kind of think about collections in a very different way in order to engage them with teaching over the past sort of 5 to 10 years. But I also should say that this is an integrated service. I have about 50 to 60 members of staff. About half of them at the moment are furloughed, which for sort of non-UK participants is the government scheme that takes people out of work and the government subsidises them. So we're working with a much reduced workforce, but we have a quite well-developed public offer. We're based in a very multicultural town outside London, and we have a strong focus on our engagement with local communities. It's very, and we have numerous stakeholders in the local community, but also relating to our collections. We have a lot of organisational records relating particularly to the English countryside. Our learning spans everything from very popular sessions of outdoor learning based around play for under fives through to regular sessions for older people with dementia, and a huge amount in between that, including schools. And we work closely with a number of specialist panels. And in fact, they've been very relevant and helpful to us in the last couple of months in helping steer our way through and looking ahead to the future. If I have time, I'll come back to some of the public side, because actually it feeds into the kind of research and academic side. I suspect that our sort of 5, 6, 7 or 8 years, we've really had to think proactively about how we re-engage the museums and collections of the university, which I think, like many universities, have had sort of periods of some neglect, really. And so we have made some quite sort of big strides towards building up an academic programme. And we have 2 members of staff within my team, a director of academic engagement who is particularly responsible for the taught museum studies side of our work. And we also have an academic learning liaison officer who has done a huge amount in the last 2 or 3 years in building up connections across the university to get our collections used. So we have 2 at the moment, about to be, I think, 3 joint degree programs. So we teach a museum studies part of that, and those are linked to another discipline, at the moment classics and archaeology, but we're looking at spreading that into many other areas of the university. We run a skills training program for doctoral students in collections-based research. And increasingly, we contribute to sessions led often by academics, sometimes co-developed with us. Last year, we offered 100 sessions across the university from disciplines ranging from art to construction management. About 1,000 students participated in those over the last year through 30 different modules. And some of those modules are very practice-based. For example, we have an exhibition module where students create an exhibition, which we mount somewhere across the university, placement modules as well. And university's TEF statement, that's the Teaching Excellence Framework Statement, for the first time has included collections-based teaching as one of its sort of distinctive measures. So we feel we're sort of making progress in engaging with the university in that way. But like everyone, we were stopped in our tracks. Keeping this going has taken up a lot of resource, and maybe we had not been anticipating the kind of changes that we are now facing. For me, I think it was a sort of huge shock to me personally, but clearly also to my team, a sort of working culture where you spend your whole time with collections, working with them in one way or another, and then suddenly, the doors shut and you have to kind of rethink all of that. I felt that we did some very sensible things in those couple of weeks leading up to kind of lockdown. Everybody was given, we checked that people had proper computers at home, that they had a kind of work plan. And actually what we thought we were going to do was to kind of work as normal, but remotely. That has not turned out to be the case. I was very clear that we wanted people to have a lot of interaction with one another. Our diaries filled up with Teams meetings, with virtual coffee, with stand-up meetings. And actually that's sort of how it's been. And for me, actually, personally, it's been extraordinary because I've had much more interaction with my staff on a sort of face-to-face basis than I would normally expect to do. Learning the etiquette of talking about all of these things has been actually incredibly helpful and challenging. But quite quickly, we realized that we couldn't just continue to do our jobs, and people were doing extraordinarily well in keeping cataloguing, keeping running inquiry services. We really, really had to sort of stop and think and reprioritize how we were working now if we were going to survive. The future remains pretty uncertain, but one of the things we absolutely had to do, and I'm sure this is no surprise to everyone, we had to sort of kind of refocus our efforts on the digital. Over the past few years, we've actually, fortunately, done a lot of kind of staff training around working in agile ways and increasing people's digital skills. So we, and I'm very far down the bottom of the pile of this, but most of my colleagues are actually very able and quickly to adapt to all of this. I made everyone, we had some very unsocially distanced training just before lockdown where the whole team had to come together, and we did a lot of training on working through Teams and through some of the other platforms that we got. And we decided that what we would put our energies towards at that point was thinking very clearly about how we could remain alive digitally, and B, thinking about the future around how we would emerge out of this. So I'm just going to say a little tiny bit about some of the priorities of our work. We've been working on for some time the kind of thing that I suspect all of us want to be doing, but it had never quite we'd never got it over the line, which was a new portal for all of the university's museums and collections, a kind of a single point of entry. And although I had not imagined that my colleagues would say, we must get this over the line now, that's what they decided to do. And, hats off to them, they did. And I will provide a link to that if you want to see what that looks like. And it brings together not only a single point of entry for looking at our databases, but a lot of case studies around the work we've done around collections-based research, the online learning resources that we're developing. It's still quite a new resource. It certainly needs more attention, but it's sort of an example of something. And we know, because we spend a lot of time looking at the analytics, that it is starting to work and it's bringing people to that site. We've managed to also complete work on 2 new collections websites. And we've turned out to be able to do things that I thought were going to be impossible, like we have just prepared a new film about our museum studies program, made in half a day by one of my colleagues. And then I've got somebody saying 2 minutes, so I'm going to hurry on and just talk about the work that we've been focusing on to think about emerging out of this and what our teaching and learning will look like. So we decided to kind of think about our work streams under different headings. So the first stage of this is what our staff can do now. And we were working on our virtual classroom, our virtual museum, our virtual reading room, and in fact, our e-commerce, because we've lost income and we need to find new ways of monetizing some of the services that we provide. And then we started to look at what we've called socially distanced teaching, and that is what we're going to aim for. So we feel we've come a long way, and we're working with some of the same platforms that Judy is, Blackboard, Collaborate, and we've been using all sorts of different technologies to help. In fact, our academic colleagues come in now and starting to film material that will be part of their online teaching. The university, but we're very convinced that we should be providing socially distanced access to collections, but in a very modified way. And so I don't think I'm telling you anything very different, but just on a slightly different scale. And finally, I'd like to point to the fact that one of the things that we've done a lot of work on is our social media, and that has had an extraordinary time in lockdown. So we have a very successful Twitter account for the Museum of English Rural Life, but we've also put into action a plan that we've had up our sleeves but we've never had time for, which was to build up our Instagram profile and get it over 10,000, which is the point at which you can use Instagram to link back to your digital content. So just to give you, sorry, these figures hardly mean anything to me, but we've had 2 million impressions a week around our digital content since lockdown. So by the end of May, and I'm afraid I don't have an update, we had 21 million impressions and over 1 million engagements. So just to give you a sort of flavour of where we are, I think I'm going to stop because I can see Annalise waving at me madly, but thank you.
Thanks, Kate. That's great, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions to follow. I think there's lots of different things that have come up in terms of using, as you just was finishing now, social media to engage, but also then having socially distanced engagement. So there's quite a lot of different strategies that it seems you're thinking about at the moment. And something that I thought was interesting that came up was this question of digital literacy and how you're working around that. So I'm sure there'll be lots to talk about there. But I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, who is Thomas Cador. And Thomas is Senior Teaching Fellow at UCL in London, University College London, where he leads one of the university's flagship object-based learning modules. So I'm going to hand over to Thomas.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thanks, Annalise and Anna for organizing this and for inviting me along. And it's great to hear how some of my colleagues have responded in sometimes very similar ways, but also it's great to hear some good ideas to pilfer. And I guess this is part of the idea of having this event, that we can learn from each other's experiences so far and also from each other's ideas, and maybe the discussion could also then potentially think about things that haven't gone so well and things that others should potentially avoid. I'm also really happy to see some of my colleagues from UCL, both from the museum, some of the curators are there, which is great to see, and from the Institute of Archaeology. And obviously we have a second speaker from UCL as well later on. I just do something as well before I get going, and I know I don't have a lot of time, but I'm doing this on purpose now, is just to change my background. So now I'm in the Grant Museum of Zoology, and I know Tanis is there as well. And so there are some possibilities of using the online, but I didn't do that at the start on purpose, because I also really enjoy it. Maybe makes me sound very voyeuristic, but that insight we've had over the last 3 months into people's lives, right, into people's sitting rooms and spare bedrooms, and if those who are lucky enough to have their own office into their home offices, I think from a person who's fascinated by material culture, I find that really fascinating in itself. And obviously people are. This is not an accidental thing. People are usually very careful about how they frame themselves if they when they go online and open this window to the world. So I think that's really interesting, and something for our students as well to think about. And I know Anna from Moda in Middlesex has started this project on a podcast on the home and what home means, and I think there's a really interesting link there. But I don't want to take up more time by blabbering, which is a danger. So I have a few things I thought I should be talking about very briefly. So in very simple terms, so my role at UCL is I work in a department that's the Arts and Sciences department, the BASC program. Some of you might have heard of this in the UK. So it's an interdisciplinary arts and sciences degree. So not specific to museums or artifacts or heritage in any way, but literally very interdisciplinary, where we have students who are focusing mainly on humanities, but also taking sciences or the other way around. And therefore our approach to using material culture is not about training the next generation of curators, although some of them that's happened, that some students come to us having had no ambitions in going into museums, and because of the work we've done with them, they've decided to go that way. But how we approach collections and collections-based learning is as a way of looking at the world, as a way of knowing and of making meaning. And that's really the key thing for us to think about. And therefore, it's not really about then the response to the lockdown like this has not really been about, oh my God, we can't access the collections, although that's a problem in itself. How are we going to replace it? It's about then thinking about, okay, let's go back to the beginning and let's start thinking about what is it really, why we are using collections? What is the purpose for us using collections? It's not for their own sake, but actually for the sake of the learners, right? It's for what we can do with them. And then instead of just trying to replace it by a simple digital two-dimensional alternative, is actually to think about then, okay, from the beginning, how do we communicate or try and get as close to as possible to communicating what we've been trying to do with the collections all along in a largely digital environment. And this is really how we have started thinking about this. And what's really interesting for me personally about that is that I'm working at the moment on a textbook for UCL Press, which hopefully when it comes out on object-based learning. So when it comes out, it will be freely available to download for anyone, no cost. But obviously, having had to work on this right now, I was thinking this is great. In the second term where I'm teaching one of my object-based learning modules, I just used the classes and work with the students, and it really will help me with going through the motions for this textbook. And then obviously the lockdown happened, and I really have to rethink now and in a way future-proof that textbook much more. And that's thanks to the lockdown, that I have to think about, what about all those people? And it's not just because of an epidemic. What about all those people who can access collections, who may just have a local museum somewhere nearby where they can look at some artifacts behind glass, but for whom object handling is just not an issue. It's just isn't an option. So I think it's made me much more conscious of access in different ways, and hopefully it will therefore make the book, it will delay it slightly, sadly, but it will hopefully make the book better. At UCL, we are once or before the lockdown, and hopefully eventually again, we are really lucky that we have a nice range of museums and collections with something like 750 million different objects, artifact specimens to choose from. So we have an art museum, and it's great to see Andrea here from the art museum. We have the Grant Museum that I'm in at the moment of zoology. And Tanis, the curator, is present as well. And then we have an Egyptian archaeology museum called the Petrie, Egypt and Sudan, and the Pathology Museum, and then also 12, 15 other collections in different departments. So lots to choose from for our students. And this has really been the benefit, that we pride ourselves in our modules that we don't use the same object or specimens twice. So every time we have a new cohort of students, they get a whole new set of things to work with that nobody has looked at potentially for years, sometimes ever, since they've been entered into the collections. So then the challenge has really been, with the lockdown, how do we replace this, and how do we work with this? And one thing that's been really helpful for me also, and just bringing it back, then it's not about objects, it's not about stuff, it's not about museums. All of these are important, but it's about the people. It's about what the people do with these collections, what the people do, and in the first instance the students, but also colleagues. And one of the things that has been really on my mind is, and I know Judy is working in this field as well, is apart from the learning benefits, is the well-being benefits. You know, we've seen this for years, and gradually now there are projects emerging on how we work with collections to not just support learning, but also well-being, because there's so much potential there that people tend to lose themselves if you let them with object handling and engaging with slow looking and so on, and forget about many of the other problems that are there very much. So when you walk out the door, sadly, those problems will be back. But when they're in our spaces, when they're working with the collections, when they're staring at something, an artwork, or for 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, they can forget about all of this. They can lose themselves in the state of flow. And then we've been thinking about, okay, can we harness some of this at least, even when we are online, even when people can't come into our spaces? And I can provide some links if you want. There's a number of projects going on in relation to that, what universities are able to do and university collections are able to do, including UCL, but we're also working with King's College in London, we're working with Oxford and others who are contributing to this, providing online resources for well-being that are still culturally mediated. So cultural assets online. It's obviously not the same as coming into a space like the Grant Museum or like the UCL Art Museum, but it is still there are still many possibilities, and I can, after I'm finished, I won't do it now, I have 2 minutes, perfect. I will post some links into the chat about different museums and collections around the world who have gone virtual and have offered lots of opportunities for people to engage with them. And I've seen it in action. I've seen my daughters engage with this. They walk through the Smithsonian in National History Museum in Washington, D.C., which it's probably very unlikely that they will get there anytime very soon in person, but they can actually go through these museums and explore, including the gift shop, which was a great hit. So seeing as I have about a minute left, I skip ahead to the last thing I really wanted to talk about, and that is some of the lessons so far. And I've said before that the lessons, exactly, we won't know them all until this coming academic year at least is over, I think, because we are still going to be under the shadow of COVID-19 for the foreseeable future, sadly. But one thing that I've definitely learned when we had to go online very quickly in March was how precious face-to-face contact is. And I feel personally, I've taken this for granted a little bit. Actually, how precious the time is for me to work with the students on a personal level. And in a way, so therefore, I think it should bring about a rethinking of how we structure our face-to-face contact, even when we can be 100% face-to-face again in the hopefully not so distant future. That rethinking actually the precious time spent face-to-face with our students is really important. And the second lesson, I think, and the second thing to think about before I finish is, hopefully when we come out at the end of this, we can think much more carefully, well, the thinking has to start now, but we can come out with a much more sustainable and much more inclusive curriculum as well. Obviously, the recent and current events, whether it's the Black Lives Matter, or the COVID-19 related lockdown, they should really make us think about both of those things. And there's an interesting position paper by Dan Hicks that I can also circulate about museums and sustainability and what will happen after the lockdown. But also, I think the inclusion question is a really important one, as I've already mentioned with my textbook, that I'm really conscious about access, and much more so now that nobody can get into our collections. But these are really the three things for me to take away. So that is the preciousness of spending time face to face with colleagues, students, learners, and the inclusion and the inclusiveness of how we engage with our spaces in the future, and then finally also the sustainability of our curricula and what we can learn from having had to work on online to such a degree. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Thomas, and thanks also for sort of tidying up that all of those key takeaway messages so nicely. So, you know, really important issues around inclusion and access is something that definitely I've been thinking a lot about, and I know I'll have a lot of questions to follow up, and I'm sure others will as well as sustainability and thinking around how we change. Oh, your background has just changed as well. Also, yeah, obviously, you know, great background. I didn't say anything about that. And it's the importance of face-to-face contact, which I'm sure resonates with lots of the colleagues that are here today. So thanks for all of those great points, which we'll expand on in a minute. I'm now going to introduce the next speaker, who is my colleague, Zoe Hendon. So we work together at the Museum of Domestic Design and Architecture, and Zoe is head of collections there. So over to you, Zoe.
Thank you, Anna. I hope you can all hear me. Yes? Okay. Great. So good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this event. As Anna said, I'm Zoe Hendon and I'm Head of Collections at the Museum of Domestic Design and Architecture, which is part of Middlesex University. So I think a lot of the things that I'm going to say have kind of echoes of things that people have already said. But one thing that also strikes me is the very much the kind of the way in which object-based learning is always very contextual within an institution. So even though we're all interested in object-based learning, the way in which we do that is very much defined by partly the objects and partly the institutions and the courses with which we work. So I think that's just something worth mentioning. So as a brief overview of what we have at MODA, our collections relate to the design and decoration of what you might call the suburban or modest-sized homes in Britain from the late 19th to the late 20th century. And these include things like wallpapers, textiles, and so on. But in addition, a lot of the things in our collections were accumulated by designers as visual inspiration. So we support, kind of broadly speaking, two kinds of inquiry into our collections, partly a historical or kind of critical, analytical approach to looking at collections. And secondly, although these are not quite, you know, it's not really a real distinction to make, but a more kind of creative visual inspiration response to our collections. And we serve both an internal Middlesex audience and the wider audience of researchers, students and members of the public. Like Judy, we partly serve art and design students, but Middlesex University is a kind of large university which has a wide range of courses. So in addition to working with art and design students, we also work with students from, for example, sociology, creative writing, different kinds of courses and so on. So where were we before the collection, pre-COVID? Our collections were used to support learning and teaching in a variety of ways before lockdown. And as has been mentioned, often this was through object-based learning sessions, which either took place in our own collection centre or sometimes in classrooms on campus. And in these sessions, these were always embedded within courses, and we worked with tutors to design sessions appropriate to students' needs and interests, so that students would have the opportunity to see, touch, handle, and think about objects in a very kind of intense way, rather like Judy mentioned before. And these sessions were always contextual, in other words, relevant to their course. So that might be quite different if you're talking to creative writing students versus illustration students versus sociology students, even though the objects might be the same. But also, I think it's also important to mention that learning was always social. Part of the value lay in looking at and thinking about and experiencing objects and discussing those objects with other students in that moment with other members of staff. And I think there's something very important about having brains in the room together and the kind of interaction between people's physical bodies and brains in a room at the same time, which is something that you know, as Thomas said, is one of the things that we've now realised how important that is. So I think the main challenge that we're facing now is that social distancing, however that's going to be defined, will probably mean that we can't run these object-based learning sessions in the same way for the foreseeable future. And I don't really believe that it's going to be possible to replicate that experience of close looking at objects in an online space, so via Zoom or Teams or whatever, and make that a meaningful experience. So we need to think differently about how we use the resources that we've got online on our website to support student learning. And our websites, perhaps Anna or Annalise can put the website address in the chat at some point or in the notes afterwards, so you can have a look. So this is all slightly to be worked out. We haven't quite, you know, defined this yet, but what we're imagining is that this might be through a blended mix of asking students to look at parts of our website and then participate in, for example, a short online discussion with their tutor and either Anna or myself, and then before going off to complete a task on their own or have a further discussion with their student peers, for example. And there might be any number of ways this could be achieved, either synchronously or asynchronously, and it could also involve, you know, production of short videos to support that. Some of the challenges that we face are that as museum staff, we don't have direct responsibility for the content or delivery of academic courses. Unlike some of the people who've spoken already, like as Kate mentioned, we don't quite deliver courses in the same way at Middlesex. So we need to work closely with academic colleagues to support their teaching. But this is obviously happening in a context in which everyone is struggling to get up to speed with online technologies and new kinds of pedagogy. And actually, I think what we're finding is that everything takes longer when you have to do it in an online environment. So whereas you might have gone into a classroom and just talked for 15 minutes, now if you've got to make a video of yourself, that's taking a lot longer to make that video than it would have just taken to just pop into a classroom. And it requires you to think about that differently as well. So there's a way in which everything's taking longer than before. But it's up to us to kind of work with academic colleagues to show them what could be possible. I would say that our website in general is aimed at a general audience, but we can tailor sessions or activities for specific groups of students around our website if we work with tutors to do that. I think it's worth pointing out here that some of the things we could do might be sessions in Moodle, for example. But what we're going to have to get more sophisticated at is defining our impact in terms of the use of our website. So Middlesex University is probably only going to be interested in how many Middlesex students have engaged with our website. And that's quite hard to know through analytics because the analytics are not that sophisticated. So it's possible that Middlesex or any tutors might be using our website and doing great stuff with it, but unless they tell us, we won't be able to report on that to our, you know, senior colleagues. So that is something that is going to be, I think, something we're going to have to think about a bit more. So what strategies are we employing? We've been putting a lot of effort into generating great online content, and my colleague Anna has been hosting a series of podcasts around the theme of home, and particularly home under the constraints of COVID-19. And so we've also, in addition to the podcast, we've been developing short videos and so on. So if you go to our website and have a look at the conversation page, you'll see what I mean. There's been some constraints around this because we can only use objects from our collections which we've got digitized. So anything that we want to relate back to the collections has to be things that have already been photographed, because we haven't been able to get to the collections in person since March. And as I say, these online resources are suitable for a general audience, but they could either be used for teaching in a variety of ways, or they could be the beginning of a discussion with tutors about how we could develop more tailored things to go into Moodle or whatever. And the main aim of our that conversation page on the website is to demonstrate our engagement with the wider world, to show that the objects and the themes associated with our collections are relevant to current debate. You know, we're not just a museum that's full of dusty old bits of wallpaper, but we want to talk about home and things like that and how these relate to the current environment. Yes, I see your 2-minute warning, thank you. And we're also increasingly thinking about the collections and our website differently and considering ways in which these could support discussions around matters around information, data, knowledge, the inherent biases and cultural assumptions that are kind of baked into our website. And in this way, some of these discussions are, I can imagine, blending into ideas around decolonizing the curriculum and the Black Lives Matter debate and how we present information. And we could be asking students to kind of critique that in our online space. So I think MODA is fortunate to be a little bit ahead of some other institutions in the development of our website, but we're aware that there's a lot more that could be done. And I know there isn't time to talk about this now, but I think there's we're in a very interesting moment where learning and research and teaching are increasingly at a kind of interesting point, and there's lots of scope to develop this further. So in short, we don't have all the answers, but I think, as other people have said, we remain committed to using the collections as a basis for interesting and challenging discussions that will continue to support student learning, albeit in ways that we couldn't have previously imagined before March. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zoe. I mean, it's really interesting for me to hear this, obviously, as colleagues, and hear you talk about a lot of these things. But, you know, I think certainly points that I'm sure will be picked up around, I thought what you were saying about the way the digital we might be more reflexive about the uses of that, and actually thinking about how to challenge some of the ways in which maybe knowledge has been constructed, produced, and use that in ways that we can interact with students. So I think, you know, sort of connects to some of the things that have already been said, I think, especially Thomas and also Judy. So yeah, so it's great to see these things connecting. So Sam Beath is going to be next, and Sam is Senior Conservator and Collections Care Manager at Manchester Museum and is specialised in educational technology. So over to you, Sam.
Hello, I can't see my screen. It's the first time I've used this technology, I'm sorry. Anyway, I'll carry on talking, I assume you can see me. Yeah, I've been working in museums for 20 years as a conservator. I worked at Liverpool Museums for 10, 11 years, and now I'm at Manchester Museum as collection care manager and senior conservator. So in a way, perhaps I'm coming at collection-based learning from a slightly different perspective. But at Manchester Museum, all staff are pretty much involved in teaching in some way or facilitating university teaching. We had last year, I think we had 11,500 student interactions, whether that was actually researching collections or delivering sessions with us, or staff actually teaching to them. I'm going to talk about something slightly different, I think, because a lot of what other speakers have spoken about, we do as a university museum. We work, we work across all faculties using the collection. I'm going to talk a little bit about my sort of widening participation and inclusion work. So as a conservator, I've always been very interested in how I can give access to objects to people, because I've got a very privileged access to working with collections, and that isn't always extended to others because of the risks associated with objects. And about 10-15 years ago, I got very involved in scanning and replication technology, in a way from a conservation perspective, but then looked at the sort of educational outreaches of that. Whether you're scanning buildings, microscopic objects, giving people access to objects that they wouldn't normally have access to. Because like most museums, we have a collection that we handle, but there are objects we obviously can't handle. So I started looking at haptic technology, and now doing some work applying digital information to physically printed objects. And then this led me to looking at access for sort of people that don't come into museums very often, because unless there's a facilitated session, they haven't got access to objects. So the blind, the visually impaired, perhaps people with intellectual sensory needs that aren't always facilitated other than in sessions. So looking at specifically at certain groups. So that's one aspect of the work that I've been doing. But we've also, to go back to what we were doing sort of pre-COVID, I think this period at the moment has given everybody a sort of period of self-reflection as well on practice. So at Manchester Museum, we've been looking at decolonising the collection. So that's something that's sort of high on our priority list. And how we talk to people about the collection, how we include people in those conversations. We've got a museum website called Museum in Quarantine. We're trying to have much more socially engaged conversations with users. So again, we've got a very active social media output. But for me, you know, my work's very object-based. So some of the things that we were doing pre-COVID were taking objects out of the museum. So we installed Maharaja, which is an Indian elephant skeleton, in the middle of Piccadilly Station for 2 weeks. We had students engaging with commuters. We had conversations about objects, that object in particular, not only with the South Asian community that wouldn't necessarily come into the museum, but just people that just wouldn't come into the museum. So that was one element that we were hoping to do more of, which is obviously not so straightforward anymore. We also had an inflatable museum where we would take the museum collections into schools, and we would have curators, students go out with collections into spaces, because it's sometimes quite expensive for a school to get into a museum. I think that's something the schools are going to struggle with after COVID, is finding the money to come into museums. And also museums are going to struggle to have the funds to go out to schools. We did sessions at a school called Lancastrians in Manchester, where we used all the staff, so conservators, curators, education outreach, the shop, and we worked with those children that had really severe, complex physical and intellectual needs to start learning about objects, how we used objects, the value of different jobs in a museum. So trying to sort of widen it, look at the museums and the jobs in museum in a much broader perspective. And that was a really good session. That was a really good project, because after 6 weeks, the children that we worked with, which is a small group of 10, then delivered the sessions in the inflatable museum in that school. So that was some of the things that we were doing. My job's very hands-on. I'm not quite sure how that's going to continue afterwards. I think we're going to have to find ways of socially distancing. We've been doing a lot of volunteer projects where they've actually been working on real museum objects. At Manchester Museum, we've got 200 volunteers, and we were working on conserving a Japanese bronze incense burner, and that was then for the volunteers to talk about the engagement on the gallery. So those sorts of sessions have obviously stopped, and there's been a lot of filming done in the museum of those types of practices. So that sort of content is starting to be put online. The curators are delivering a lot of lectures online. But for me, the sensory engagement with objects is really important for inclusion, and I'm not quite sure if we figured out ways of how we're going to do that in the next 12 months. So I'm not sure there is an answer to that yet, other than, you know, just allowing 1 or 2 people into a space to do that activity. So that's going to be really complex, I think. But I think, as all of the other speakers have said, the digital online allows you to reach people that wouldn't necessarily engage with the museum, and it's making that offer irresistible for them to come in 12 months' time to engage with the collections in a range of ways, and also feel like they're welcome as well. So that the idea of decolonising, we've got a South Asia collective that we're working with very closely at the moment to do a co-curated South Asia gallery with the British Museum, and that work's been going on for 12 months. So those sorts of conversations around collections and how you present collections and who you involve in those discussions are ongoing as well. So there's lots of potential. The 3D digital world has been around for the last 20 years. It's still, the Smithsonian do amazing things with their 3D scan collection. As Thomas was saying earlier, the Smith has an amazing online offer, but that costs a lot of money. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for museums in the next couple of years, is where they find the funding to do those activities that engage with the public and students. We offer, we've got a collection studies centre in the museum. We're going to have to find ways of bringing out the collection, as your other speakers have said, because there's nothing really replaces that interaction with an object. So, thank you. I don't know whether that 10 minutes was it?
Yes, I think. Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. That's I think it's especially interesting to hear from the perspective of a conservator, as someone that's so hands-on, has been thinking so much about the haptic and so many of the challenges that are brought upon that I think connects to some of the things that Judy was saying, and also some of the technical issues, I guess, around quarantining objects and for how long, and just we've been speaking about some of the conceptual overarching frameworks, but there's also all this kind of nitty-gritty of how do we deal with that. So it's kind of really useful to have you talk about that, and hopefully we can expand on that in the question time. We've got now our last speaker that I'm very pleased to introduce, who is also a student. So we, as I think I mentioned at the beginning, we wanted to have a student voice within our panel, and she's a student at UCL as well, so University College London at the Institute of Archaeology, and it's Amanda Ford-Spora, who has been actively involved in collection space learning there. So over to you, Amanda.
Thanks everyone for still being here. I probably wanted to just sort of thought about drawing a few themes together, because all of the panelists have really reverberated with myself and with my work. So just in terms of putting their COVID-19, decolonisation, Black Lives Matter, and that's something that is certainly not new. Well, COVID-19 is new, but not new to where we're at, but are very much on our agendas. But the other thing also, and particularly what Thomas spoke about, which really reverberated, is thinking about people, social connections, and objects. So I'd like to just pose a question to everyone to think about. What was your first experience of when you got your passion for historical objects? Because all of us obviously now are very interested in being able to handle them and be involved with them. But personally, my first experience was with my mother and an exercise book and an encyclopedia, which is probably indicative of my age, looking at this and then consequently going to a museum. Now, I'm just putting that there because we all are now very focused on being involved with the objects and thinking about how that's going to be replaced. But I would contend that this is just that we're moving into new ways of experiencing. So thank you, Anna, and thank you, Annalise, for including me today. I do represent the student voice, so I feel like it's almost a bit awkward that I'm last because all of these very experienced people have spoken first. So I hope I'm going to be able to add something. So I'm both a student at UCL, but I'm also working with objects. And I'm very much a champion of working with objects for the ordinary person, the non-professional, and particularly teens. So in my time at UCL, I've worked in outreach in primary schools and in the Petrie Museum itself. And of course, and someone else touched on this point, I think it was actually Sam, mostly with unprovenanced material. And this, in the time that I've worked there, became an interesting conversation with me because I really want to think about accessibility for anyone and everyone safely. And also, I want to be able to engage with complex dialogues about objects, not just a standard, this is a standard Shabti or something like that. So I was already in my research wanting to expand both getting out to people outside the reach of the collection, take the collection out to people, but it couldn't be the collection itself. Now, to this end, I have one of my 3D printed shabties that I use in my research. Here we have front, back, and I couldn't not show you the bottom. I'll show you a little more closely, or probably a little dark. It says replica in Arabic and in English. So my research was wanting to get accessibility and take objects, and it's from the Petrie Museum and one from Manchester Museum to Sudan, to Australia and to Manchester. And I'm coming up to be going to East London as well, out at UCL East. And I'm wanting to take objects from other places and bring them together and take them to places as well. So it's this accessibility, but also not on provenance material that we don't know much information about. I want to have real, proper, critical conversation about these. So I was already starting to do this, and then COVID happened. So interesting situation for all of us. And a lot of us have expressed this. Who would have imagined saying to a whole lot of museum professionals, a whole lot of people working, researching with objects, you have 5 minutes to just pick up whatever is on your desk, and that's it. That's all you have to work with for the next 6 months, because that's pretty much what we've got. So of course, it occurs to me the ideas and the challenges, which was one of the questions we were asked about, the access to the objects, the access to what we have on our computer laptops. I'm fortunate for my project, I own these objects because they were funded as by myself. So I have them with me, but that is not the case. So accessibility became a really big issue for my thought throughout this whole situation. So access to objects, staff being on furlough at museums is also a point. How do then you continue with collections, or how do you have questions or research or so forth going on? Funding, of course, is an enormous question. I mean, it's always an enormous question, but now we're thinking of developing in new ways, and accessing remotely. So the sort of strategies that I've now been working to do with my research going forward. I've luckily conducted a lot of my groups already, my focus groups already, but are to think about how I will conduct them with blended learning, how I would do them virtually. And in fact, the developer of my replica here is looking into ways that we can use a multitude of representations. So it will likely include some online access to the objects that will then give this way that we learn, because I would contend that, yes, we all like to hold the real thing. And obviously, I am not speaking to people who don't understand the value of holding the real thing or being in the presence of the real thing. But even there, I've subtly moved the ballpark, haven't I? Holding the real thing, being in the presence of the real thing, representation. I think it's a new way of experiencing that what we're thinking about. And yes, it takes time, and yes, it takes funds. I hope going forward that we are going to continue to develop these ways of having objects accessible to people in more remote locations, people who can't walk into museums or don't feel they're able to walk into museums to access heritage and be able to have critical conversations with them. I think that's what's to come out of this for all of us, so that it's highlighted for me that we can make objects more accessible to more people in new ways of experiencing them. And I think that's the bottom line, that we're looking for these new ways. So that's what I wanted to add. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thanks for that. And I think it's, you know, it's a really, it's sort of tied up or tied together, I think, a lot of the different issues that have come up in the different presentations, this thinking around accessibility. And I think just that sort of finishing of new possibilities of access for new audiences, and actually and tapping on some of those issues in new ways as well, but maybe expanding the kind of conversations and the criticality that we bring to these conversations. So I think that's been a really sort of great way of rounding off all the different presentations. Whilst also, I guess, linking, with access also comes the question of limitations that we need to think, well, who has access to these technologies? There's socioeconomic factors that will come into play. So I feel that access really is the sort of core concept that has really been cropping up across all the different talks. So maybe that's something that we can expand on more. And I am aware though of the time, so I don't want to eat into the questions. So I think we're probably just going to move on to questions from yourselves. I mean, I think Annalise and I have a number of questions that we'd like to ask, but I'm sure our audiences, that sounds, everyone attending this event today also does. So yeah, so I guess I'm going to hand over to Annalise now, who's going to be moderating the discussion. But thanks very much. Also, just want to say thanks very much to all the speakers. If we were all together in one room, we'd probably be having some sort of round of applause or sort of cheering. So we have to be doing this remotely from our respective.
We can still give a round of applause.
We can still do it. Yeah, we can still do it. Yeah. So thanks very much. And over to you, Annalise, to just moderate whatever questions there have been posted already or new questions that might come up from our listeners.
All right, so I'm just going in order of the ones that have been posted up. So the first one that we had was from Nikki Reeves for Judy. And I was just wondering whether Nikki wanted to ask the question himself or whether he just wants me to read it out. So if you want to ask it yourself, maybe just put on your mic, make sure you're not muted.
Hi, I can ask it, or let me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, very briefly. So hi everybody. And I think my question, which was right at the beginning in response to Judy, has in many respects been reflected on by both Sam and by Amanda in lots of really helpful ways. But it was a really quite basic one, I guess, which is Judy helpfully pointed out the limitations of doing detailed object-based analysis type classes if you can't be engaging with the object. She talked about like having a series of photos not being a suitable proxy. And my question was merely like, given where we are, and we might be doing some quite short-term teaching solutions for how we can replicate object engagements online, is film going to be sufficient? Like if we made like little low-tech films of object engagements and handling and hearing it and touching it and making it glint in the light, or do we just need to radically reimagine what we're going to do? Because I'm just curious, if I had a class with like 20 objects and we used to look at them really carefully and feel them and hear them and touch them and perhaps taste them or smell them, and we can't do any of that, should we just do something completely different? Or and I like the idea of just low tech things rather than I mean, there's definitely a place for really interesting 3D printed things or other types of experiences. So that's my comment, thought.
Thank you for the question. So we've talked about this endlessly amongst my staff team, and I think there is a place for what you're describing, but that we have to be very clear about what it is. So in a lot of the writing and thinking and professional development that I've done around object-based learning, I think I would try and summarize all of that by saying what I'm really aiming for is to remove the mediator. So much of the way people meet objects or engage with them. So if they read an object record in your searchable online catalogue, they'll be reading a piece of descriptive text that will have been written by somebody. If they encounter it in a catalogue or a book, it's the same thing. If they meet it in a gallery space, it's been, every photograph has been taken to show the object in a particular way. Every object that's seen in a gallery space has been curated to look like that and to tell a story. And so much of what I want to do is take that mediator out and provide a space where there can be that magic that happens when somebody meets an object and can just draw their own conclusions. So I think we have to be really clear that those films that you're talking about, and we're talking about getting people to talk about the objects they love or the ones that have most resonance for them. So for example, my colleague Anna she actually trained in Central St Martin's as a costume designer. So she's worked in theatre. She has lots of great stories to tell, and she will be able to do some awesome presentations, when we can get back in the stores and do this kind of filming work, talking about her personal experience of an object and what it means to her. But I think we have to be really clear that it's storytelling and that it's mediated, and that it's not giving what we would previously have been trying to give in an object handling session, which is that unmediated meaning-making experience for somebody.
We've been doing sort of online object handling with schools and using various techniques that have been working very well. My colleague Ollie Douglas has blogged about this, and in fact there's some of the resources that he developed around. We had a kind of extraordinary moment with, sorry, this is very different, but one of our social media sort of threads was around us hooking up with a game called Animal Crossing, which is a kind of worldwide game. And what we actually did was we led people to be able to do object handling with objects that they would find around the house. And it's worth looking at that. And the other quick and dirty thing that we've been using is photogrammetry, which you can get free software off the internet. And it's just using photography to do quite high quality 3D imaging, and we've done that quite easily, and we found that we can actually do it via lockdown. So those are two very sort of quick and easy. I mean, I absolutely think Judy's sort of thoughtful comments about the kind of pedagogy are right, but these are just sort of practical solutions. And actually what we've been trialing some of our teaching in schools, because schools have been very keen for us to go into sort of in-reach into schools, and that has been a revelation how a 9-year-old can really get object-based teaching virtually. And we've used Google Classroom, which is the software that schools have available, and they can interrogate our databases, they can work with an object in their setting and be led through it, and that's been really interesting. So it's not objects from our collections necessarily, but we've been teaching them to sort of have a sort of an object-based learning experience. And I can, obviously tell you more about that at a later date if that's helpful.
Okay, great. I'm going to move on unless anyone else has something to say. Yeah, Anna or Thomas, sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Anna, if you want to. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to some degree echo what Kate and Judy have said, but with a maybe a little expansion, and to some degree, I think this might potentially answer one of the other questions I've seen by Maria in the chat from the Huntarian in Glasgow, and that emphasis that we have placed, I guess for obvious reasons today, on object handling. And the fact that, yes, we are, at least most of us, I definitely, we are talking more about a more holistic sensory experience, and not every object obviously can be handled for whatever reasons. We have artworks in the art museum that nobody ever handles, including the curators, only with very, very strict restrictions, or obviously then things that are safely to handle for everybody. So And when we think about this, I think the key question we should ask ourselves in terms of what can be moved online, in terms of doing videos or 3D imaging, if there is resource for this there, or photography, is again, what are we trying to achieve with this? And to what degree is there a benefit of handling an everyday object that people might have at home, rather than what's the benefit, what's the added value of having museum objects? And can we then distill that? And obviously we know there's a lot of ways of engaging with museum objects, in particular those that can't be handled through other means, like for example through drawing is one really good example, that we should use more of those offline activities where people can engage with potentially a two-dimensional image of an object, but still engage physically with it, right? Drawing, working with clay or Play-Doh, things like that, but people can still manually do something, even though they can't physically touch the object. So I think the key question is really, what is the added value of doing this with museum objects rather than everyday objects? And if there isn't one, then we should think about activities that people can do with objects they might have in their own home. And then think very carefully about the added value of working with heritage collections, which there are lots. I don't want to get started on this, but I think this is really the key question.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. And that actually links in, if anyone else, one of Maria's questions, Maria, if you want to actually jump in on this, please let me know, was also about using the other senses, because we do talk a lot about touching, and I know I personally do, but whether anyone has any examples, Thomas already kind of mentioned that aspect of how to bring those other senses in as well, when you're either working before the lockdown or during the lockdown or after, how that can be brought in. Maria, did you want to say anything about that quickly?
It was more, I think we're all trying to figure this out, and I think for a lot of us it's a very good, especially for fairly new students or other groups that haven't, they feel sometimes a bit intimidated by museum objects and they think they're quite different. I think it's a good leveler to try things from everyday life from around us, so a lot of us have been trying approaches like that, and probably most of you will know quite the old article by Henniger Shu about the different ways you can learn from a big Mac box. That was quite interesting, from really contemporary objects that are around us and what can it say about the society that produced them. But it's also quite challenging. So some of the ways that Thomas was mentioning about still engaging in a multi-sensory way while being online, and maybe your lecturers or the rest of the team or the class being online, and all of you, I think, are quite challenging. So I was more interested, but I was interested in hearing participants might have worked on this.
Can I just jump in a minute?
Yeah, go for it.
I've worked a lot with people with visual impairments, and sound's hugely important to them. So if you were to talk to them about a Greek vase, you know, the sound of tapping ceramic or the weight of it, and that's something that, to go back to what Thomas was saying, if you had something at home that was of a similar quality physically, to add that second sense to, you know, with people without sight or reduced sight was found to be really useful. And actually adding sound to the haptic experience that I helped develop at Manchester was a real sort of, you know, a highlight for people that we could tap something to actually hear it ring, or to hear the dull thud of something that was broken. So to bring that extra experience to that object was quite important for people with visual impairment.
Did anyone else have anything to say on that one? I think it is, because we are talking about access, so talking about digital access, who has access even to the digital space in general, and then who has access to that experience of touch. So if we're only talking about touch, who are we leaving out? So that's definitely a big theme for today, and something we probably should do more about in the future. Then the next major question that I had, so I had multiple kind of different iterations of this, was whether the speakers, or if anyone in the chat has some kind of example of this, please also feel free to chime in. But just concrete examples that have been, because we were talking about how do we test this, how do we quantify, how do we see if what we're doing is working. So examples, concrete examples of strategies that we've used, and whether those have actually been tested, whether we have any results to show how people are responding to those differently. So if anyone does have those kinds of numbers, those concrete examples, if they could share.
I collected a few numbers about the way we have been engaging with social media, but some of the sort of interesting data, and I could send it to you separately, is actually about how we use social media to engage and hook people into the web content and the information about collections. And we know that it works quite well with Twitter, but people don't stay very long. They might read the blog. We've found actually that Instagram is leading to sort of dwell times of between 8 and 10 minutes on content if we're asking people to go to blogs. I can get my digital editor, if people are interested, just to sort of put some of those bits of information together. But we have been doing a lot of thinking about how the different digital, and I mentioned that we've been seeing actually increased visits to our website, which we were surprised by, because we thought people using a large proportion of the people coming to our websites were just looking for opening times and programming, but actually they're looking to explore now, which has been really interesting. But it's been driven by the social media, really. I mean, and we're not talking about our kind of student audience, I think here we're talking about the kind of wider audiences. I mean, we're not experts at this, but we have really tried hard to kind of understand what's been happening out there. So I could send you a little bit about that if that would be helpful.
Could I just add on this point? Yes. Very brief. I think this is sort of a call to action for all of the people here that are working in the provision of learning in any way through objects, that we need to evaluate the work we do, and now so more than ever, because many of us have evaluated for years the work we do face to face, but I think very few of us have had the opportunity to evaluate the online alternative to that.
And I think you're absolutely right. And I would say personally, one of my worries about the fact that we became quite rapidly very successful at social media, but in a very light-hearted, sort of superficial way. And it wasn't about learning. It was just about getting people hooked into what we were doing. And, you know, we have huge following in North America, people who will never visit the museum. And I used to be very worried about that, and that somehow we were laughing at ourselves too, which somehow kind of also set up a tension that felt kind of wrong. And I wanted to understand a bit more about it. But actually, we've worked really hard to try and hook that kind of social media profile back into what we're doing. And we're just starting to see how that happens. I mean, I think we're at the very earliest stages a bit, but I think one of the sort of real positives perhaps coming out of this is that we will stop being very insular in our kind of profile as learning institutions, and that we might be doing much more of this, and that we will be encouraging our students to look beyond the collections that we have in our own institutions. And we've got to think about ourselves in a very different way now. I mean, we've got to be very, very local when we reopen as a museum in Reading, I think, and expect to see we will not be able to manage large numbers, but then we've also got to kind of keep going in this kind of much bigger digital domain. And I encourage you all to think that we can share a lot more of this. It's been great to hear from you all.
Well, I just had a final question that I did want to ask to all the panel, but only if there's nothing else. And I think we should also start wrapping up soon because we are running over time. So if there is no other questions, I guess I would like to just raise one final thing, which relates to the way in which COVID, as we all know, has thrown up and put into relief a lot of the structural inequalities and disparities that there are in terms of access to education, but also access to technology, and, you know, unfolding. And I mean, and in terms of not just if we think of education, but also socially, economically. So this also thinking of with the backdrop of all the sort of uprisings and mobilizing around Black Lives Matter and conversations around the curriculum, and already Thomas is mentioning the move towards a more inclusive curriculum. I just wondered if there's any sort of final thoughts on how you might be moving forward in terms of addressing some of those things in your practice, in the way that you engage with collections, which is moving a bit away from this question of online, but I think it definitely relates to the current context of COVID. So I guess my question is, how this issue of challenging questions, being critical, thinking about the role of the University Museum has come up in a lot of your presentations, but I wonder if you could just expand with some final thoughts on how you might be taking that forward.
Sorry, I think, can you hear me again? We're doing some collecting. I expect many of you are doing some collecting. And interestingly, ours seems to be forming around work with an academic researcher who's interested in how children's play has been affected by COVID. And so we're just beginning to do that. And that chimes in with a lot of the collections we hold around extreme experiences around migration, around evacuation, which the English countryside is a sort of important setting for. And we actually sort of feel very strongly, I mean, all these issues of Black Lives Matter, decolonization, but we've been thinking about those hard. But actually, I think we're now going to frame a year-long project, which will be a digital project, thinking about recovery and capturing people's kind of experiences. And we're going to invite all sorts of different people. We'll invite you if you want to do a little digital thing every week for the coming year. And this was sort of started by the fact it's the Museum of English Rural Life's 70th birthday. We have fantastic collections that were collected just after the Second World War around the Festival of Britain. And we see this coming year potentially as a year in which we are sort of resetting ourselves and kind of re-engaging with our community, and our community is re-engaging with itself, really. And we want to use those 1951 collections as the spur to make people think about 2020 and 2021 and make that an important part of what we've done as a museum, and something that may not be captured in physical form as part of our ongoing collection, but in some kind of digital form probably. And that's a project that we are very wide, you know, we won't be leading it. We think our participants will be leading it, and they may be students, but they may be members of the community, they may be artists, they may be all sorts of people.
Right, again, to go back to the South Asia Gallery, I mean, we're specifically looking at co-curation and decolonising the collection, and we've got a 2-year post that has been externally funded, so is safe, which is an unusual thing at the moment, for the next couple of years, that will sort of help in that process. And the collecting process is going alongside the gallery development with that cohort and group, and we've just getting a lot of younger socially engaged visitors and students involved in those conversations has been really important over the last 12 months really, and obviously it's going to become more important. And I think with COVID and what's happened to the BAME community specifically, I'm sure that will feature in those galleries. And again, like Thomas was saying about the curriculum, we had the Jallianwala Bagh exhibition at Manchester Museum, specifically looking at the Amritsar massacre, and that generated a lot of discussions of a difficult subject. And I think a lot of these discussions are going to be we're going to have to be very self-critical. So it's going to be quite an open process, but we're hoping to do a lot of that online where it's sort of transparent as well.
All right, everyone has their hands up, so I'm just going to go by like list on my screen. So Zoe.
Okay, yeah, so I think just to come back to Anna's question about kind of structural inequalities, and also I apologise for the fact that the bin lorry has just arrived outside my flat. So structural inequalities just reminds me that Middlesex has a large proportion of, I think the largest proportion of Black and ethnic minority students, perhaps in the UK, and also a large proportion of students who came from families in which they are the first to go to university and in which they were entitled to free school meals. So we have a very, particular demographic at Middlesex. And that does mean things like inequality of access to laptops and Wi-Fi. And I think that when we're thinking about putting stuff online, we just have to be extra aware of that. So when we're thinking about the Moda website, we're thinking about things like, can we make sure that content is optimized for use on mobile phones rather than laptops or iPads? For example, that we just made some videos which are in portrait rather than landscape format. Things like making sure that there are subtitles, all of those things, which are kind of small things, but which add up to making sure that you've thought about inclusivity, access, equality, all of those things, which, in the end add up to big things.
All right, thanks. Thank you. Thanks for that, Zoe. So next on my screen is Judy. I'm sorry if it's not the same on your screen. I promise I will get down to you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to try and be really brief. So as a museum department, and I hope as a university, we're really passionate about contributing to the decolonial agenda. We have a new institute for decolonising the arts at University of the Arts London, and we're working closely with them on a number of initiatives. So we have a proactive collecting policy to collect work by artists and makers of colour, and particularly if it speaks to issues of race or identity. And we've been working with some researchers in residence who are making a research outcome based on collections encounters, and that's happening in collections across the university. We've been co-curating and we're thinking about very deeply about what's in our collection, and particularly the more recent contemporary collecting and how well that represents us as a body. So actually we've had a quick look at the sort of proportion of artists and makers who are Black and minority, ethnic and Asian in our collections, and it's probably higher than most museums, but given that 50% of our students are ex-European Union, we should do better. And interestingly, the all staff meetings that we've been having, one would anticipate that everybody would be talking about COVID and lockdown and how we get out of lockdown. And actually, they've been completely driven by conversations about race and racism. And it's obviously deeply saddening that we're in a place where that needs to happen, but also quite invigorating, because I feel like if this is topping the pandemic, we might have a moment where change is finally possible. But also, and this is very closely linked, I think, to racism and structural inequalities, is that we know within our institution that the mental well-being of our BAME students and our LGBT plus students is much worse than students who are not. And we're doing, like Thomas, a lot of well-being work with our collections. And I know that, I was having long conversations with Mind as the lockdown kicked in about how, we've got a long-running programme of activities that we run through the Healthy Minds offer. And it's all about combating social isolation and getting people into the museum to be inspired and to meet people and to create new social networks. And we continued some weaving courses that we'd been doing in the real world online, and there was an element of being able to phone people or provide some kind of interaction that we hope maybe smoothed a tiny bit that awful cliff edge nosedive into lockdown. But I know that what I will be really preoccupied with in this coming year is thinking, how do we combat social isolation? How do we continue to do that work, combating social isolation in whatever the new world order looks like? And I definitely don't have an answer to that, but it will be high on my agenda.
Yeah, I think the conversations everywhere have been very similar in that respect. So just after these questions, we will wrap up. And if any of the speakers need to go, of course, please feel free to head off. I know we're over time. So Thomas, you're next, and then Amanda right after that.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'm trying to be super brief. And does somebody have the microphone on? There's a lot of, thank you. Okay, it's gone, I think. I'm trying to be super brief, starting with Judy's point and something I briefly mentioned already. So I think there is a lot of work happening behind the scenes at the moment in terms of generating cultural resources. I don't like the term, but it's the best I can think of at the moment for well-being in an online world. So this is something that we've been focusing a lot of attention on, not least also because I'm going to teach a module in September, October on well-being and culture essentially, and we need those resources. But the other thing, the main thing I wanted to talk about in response to Anna's question was something we've done in a way for a while is to deal with troublesome heritage, troublesome learning, difficult objects, right? And for a while, we've been working with the pathology collection at UCL, and always I'm stunned with how almost all the students who are working with some very difficult, very gory specimens, how well they deal with this. The other thing, and this is something I need to say at the end, is obviously in UCL we have a particular legacy in relation to race and racism, and that is obviously the big figure, the question of eugenics, and Francis Galton, who founded the first ever chair of human eugenics in UCL, he looms large over this. And some of you might have seen the media coverage about finally some of those buildings and lecture theatres getting denamed, not renamed, but denamed at least, with those eugenicists' names being taken off the doors and walls, which is the first step. But we have the collection in both the documents in the library, special collections, and a lot of artifacts relating to Francis Galton. And there has been a long time a demand to essentially burn the whole thing, right? But we feel that these difficult collections are really important to have as a learning experience. And what we've been thinking, and a dialogue has started with the curator for that collection for the coming academic year, especially if you need to teach more online, is to work more intensively with our students with these very difficult collections and difficult questions of race and racism and where it comes from, and in particular then also looking at UCL's role within that, and those individuals associated with UCL. So we're going to have a particular focus, at least try and deal with that and it's a really difficult balance for us to strike, I guess, without adding further to the hurt and the damage and the pain. But so using these collections in a sensitive way that hopefully will actually make a positive contribution to those dialogues, and also a learning contribution. But that's sort of our plan. And if anybody has any ideas of working with such really difficult collections, I'd be really happy to have a conversation with them. Thanks.
You wanted me to speak, Annalise?
Yes.
Yes,
that would be great.
I just wanted to pick up that theme of decolonisation, and I actually wanted to point toward a project that a fabulous colleague, a collaborative project with UCL, fabulous colleague Heba Abd Al-Gaweed, and the artefacts at Excavate Egypt. I think maybe you could put the Twitter information to that in the chat, Annalise, who is Egyptian, and she is looking at having modern Egyptian voices about Egyptology, and through the use of cartoons, and with a fabulous Egyptian cartoonist and array of cartoonists. And I just think that it's been it is of itself a phenomenal project, and particularly at this time, because it is making use of social media, and it's really setting up discussions and fitting with this whole topic at a very timely point. So I just wanted to point out that project as being part of this decolonising conversation that's so important.
All right. Thank you again, all of you, for participating. Thank you for speaking. Thank you for all of your insights and your examples, and just for being so open with what you've all encountered. I think everyone's had a really rough time, and it's always good to hear about how other people are struggling, but also the great things that they're doing. So I really, really wanted to thank all 6 of you. And also thank you to everyone who's stuck around until now. So the recording will be available online. We just need some time to bring it all together. And all of the links as well that the different speakers have been talking about, we'll make sure to also put those into the video, so that if anyone is interested in learning more, so the project that Amanda talked about with Heba, that link will be up there, but also the links to the mural, the links to all the different institutions, and that will be coming your way. We'll send out an email once that's done. So thank you all again for coming. And I hope this brings up more discussions. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or anyone that you want to be put in touch with. I'm sure we can all benefit from discussion and keeping the conversation and keeping the ideas going. So Anna, if you just wanted to say goodbye as well to everyone, and then we'll sign off. You're muted.
Now? Can you hear me now? Oh, you can. Okay, it says my microphone is muted, so it's like on the okay now. Yeah, just to stick on to Annalise, everything Annalise just said. Thanks everyone so much, both the speakers but also participants. I think having these fora perhaps on a more regular basis. I think after this event, Annalise and I will put our heads together and just think, maybe is this something we can expand on going forward, or just because it is really helpful to just hearing what other colleagues are thinking about and the work that they're doing. And I feel that there are threads that could have been explored in more detail, just like the last one that you were picking up on, all of you, which is something that I've also been thinking a lot about, how to approach this question of decolonizing in the collections at Mode and with colleagues at Middlesex. So just to say, yeah, huge thank you, and sorry that we've ran a little bit over time, but we'll, as Annalise said, we'll keep you updated when we put the video online and additional resources that we can provide along with that. And do email us if you have any questions, just as Annalise said. So thanks everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great to see you all. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Thank you.